and about at one point, so there's an older work you wouldn't see in here. But this, I'm going to start with this image that you see is a clay kiln that was my, I used that for my thesis project when I was at the University of New Mexico. And it's a clay kiln that's wood-fired, and that was part of my interest in at that time. And the reason that I am including this is because it's kind of a metaphor for how I think about the work I make and that you'll see. So I actually had an interesting, this is coming at an interesting time, because I've just had to kind of do a review of myself for something that I've been nominated for, and I've realized that I've completely wasted my life, and I'm now I need to like do something about it. I'm just kidding about that. I was able to kind of put all the threads together, and so this idea of something that comes from the earth, and then the chamber. If anyone here is a ceramicist or done ceramics, the kiln as a space, or the oven, because I also like to bake and I make bread oven, like a clay bread oven, is this space of transfer, like alchemical transformation. And so I think that becomes the kind of metaphor for my work. So I'm going to just start with kind of quickly go through some earlier work. So from about 2002 or 2001, about the time when I met Kendra, I started a project where, so for about 10 years, I had a narrative that controlled a lot of the work I did. So I work in a lot of different mediums, and when I try to, so I don't have like the elevator pitch, like a lot of artists can say, like I do this, and they have like a 2-minute thing. I work in a lot of different ways, but the one thing I will say that connects all of my work is narrative, and particularly thinking about how living myth, folklore intersects with our experience of the world. And so this is called, this is a graphic novel called The Naked Boy, and that's a page on the left. The Naked Boy, it took me a long time to make. I self-published the first 3 parts. I actually, right now, am putting together the whole volume. I never published the whole volume together. And it's kind of a birth of the nation myth. So it's based on an indigenous story called The Bear Mother, which you can find different versions throughout Northern America. And the story is that there's in The Naked Boy, there's a little boy, a little baby who's spit out of the mouth of a white whale, and he lands on a beach. It's early spring on the East Coast, and he's met by some crows who kind of give him a little bit of disinformation, and they say that your sister has been taken by the Great Bear, which is Ursa Major, so you have to follow railroad tracks west to find him and get your sister back. So in this story, it has the logic of a dream. So if America were having a dream, all these characters play parts. So the first people he meets are, and there's also like these references to certain moments in history. So it's kind of like puritanical New England where he ends up. He meets a werewolf and a witch who are married. They're played by Walt Whitman and Gloria Steinem. And then Walt Whitman is killed by a mob. That's not his name, but he's based on him. And he becomes the guiding spirit for the Naked Boys that goes across the country. And he meets all these different people as he moves across the country. He starts from a little baby, and he's fully grown by the time he gets to this election in the fall in the West, basically the Northwest. And he meets all these characters along the way, like characters played by Frederick Douglass, characters played by like the Chicano poet Jimmy Santiago Bacchus. There's all these different people there. So the Naked Boy is a story in the sense that you could read the graphic novel, but it also yielded things like On the Other Side, that it was an installation at the Atlanta Center for Contemporary Art in 2008. I also produced things like this. This is these would become pages of the book. My wife has a letterpress. We shared a studio for a while. And so I would use the letterpress to do these posters that I would also then paper around in the town. So the character that Frederick Douglass plays is the leader of a family of escaping slaves who go through a literal underground railroad. So a a lot of also the imagery of this, and you'll see this as it plays out in the other work, is that I remember as a kid learning American history, and so it kind of went like this. 3 boats bumped into land, there were some Indians there, they met, they sort of got along, and then all of a sudden the Mayflower came, and then there was Thanksgiving, and then that's kind of like how it was like these like images, these moments that like they're not connected at all. So I wanted to play, like then there was the Underground Railroad. So I wanted to use some of that like literalness of the way history is often taught in this. So this is Freedom City is played by Chicago in this. And so Frederick Douglass is that's the character that goes there, but under there it says it is not light that is needed but fire. That's actually a quote from his wonderful lecture, What's Enslaved is the 4th of July. So this kind of overarching story that I used for about 10 years to create a work called Radio Relay Towers. So the Naked Boy was the first part. The Sleeping Giant was the second. This is an installation at the Merrillhurst Art Gym in 2006. And so in the Bear Mother myth, there's a young woman who is picking berries, and she's a bit haughty and a bit picky, and she's kind of put off a lot of suitors. She meets a handsome young man in the woods, as one often does when picking berries, and he invites her back to his place, and it turns out that he's actually a bear. And so over the winter, she becomes pregnant and she gives birth to twins, who then in these stories go on to have these cycles of these kind of heroic stories. There's a correlation there when you think about the story of Rome. So Rome, the story of Rome is Romulus and Remus were brothers who were suckled by a she-wolf. So I played with a lot of that. So in this case, the twins become the one-armed superhero. And just to give you some context, 2006, this is the Bush years. This is the beginning of the Iraq War. A lot of this is in response to that. On the left, you can see the Sleeping Giant, he's kind of the underground nascent power that's in the people. In the front there, that's a piece called Townie. So as someone who makes comics, I think about how comics work. So if anyone thinks about like what are the mechanics of a comic, you have a panel or an image, and then there's a space that's called the gutter, and then there's another panel. So in this piece, I was wondering what happens if the gutter is 3-dimensional. So the idea is that you would walk through this, and it tells the story of this kind of like American colonialism from this kind of frontier era to the suburban present. And there's a mix of images from found photos to historic photos, and it tells the story of these 2 brothers as they move through time. And so the superhero is kind of the part of the energy that goes out into the world. So that became, I did a couple comics, there were a couple installations based on this. There are also a series of sculptures. This is about 6 feet tall. This is the one-armed superhero. So in another room were these big sculptures if that was the town. So the other thing about Townie is that the town in America is often like this basic element of the democracy, right? We think of like, if you talk about a town, like if you've ever read Our Town or anything like that, there's always like the mayor, the baker, there's those one unit. And so in this case, the town was this idea of this like democracy. It's also like Rome becomes the center of an empire. So anyway, here's this monument, which is this one-armed superhero, and he's clearly missing his arms as a part of his power that's gone, and it's this sort of fragile monument. And so once I and then there's the third part of this is the Green Man of Portland. If you've ever been on the Green Line in downtown Portland, there's between 5th and 6th Avenue between Gleason and Burnside are a bunch of pieces that tell the story of the Green Man of Portland. So after I kind of wrapped that up, I felt like I mined that. I started to do a series called the North American Codex. So one of the things I became really interested in, and part of this is reading a book called 1491 by this person named Charles Mann, who talks about, and then 1493, which just talks about the world between, like, the effect on the world of the colonialism from when Columbus arrives. And I mean, this is apt given that yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day. And then what happened when you mixed it's called the Columbian Exchange, what happened when you mixed all these cultures, flora, fauna, and everything. So this is at the Portland Biennial in 2012. So I did a series of these vessels that all have images and snippets of folk songs on them, and then there are this series. These are woodcuts, so that the bees made honey in the lion's head is a line from an old folk song or blues song, and so and then for me that image is like the lion is like usually you see this as the skull of the lion. I wanted the lion to be this like life force that also has this other life force in it, and this kind of dynamism. But I made these large woodcut prints on rice paper and then we pasted them to the gallery wall because I didn't want these to have the kind of preciousness you normally see in those kind of works on paper. So then around that same time, I had a residency in Ashland, Oregon, at Southern Oregon University, and down there is the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and there was this play that was commissioned called The Unfortunates, and it was an amazing play. And at the same time, I curated a show that was at the Schneider Museum called Fighting Men, which was 3 artists who I really love, with Leon Golub, Jack Kirby, and Pete Volkus. So Leon Golub is a painter, Jack Kirby is the co-creator of most of the Marvel Universe, and Pete Volkus is a ceramicist. So normally they wouldn't be together, but they seem to fit together for me. So that show was also down in Ashland, and I saw this, and I was like, this is like the imagery I do. So I became friends with them, and actually particularly one person, Ramiz Monsef, who's the actor and one of the writers. So we did a comic based on The Unfortunates that then, that he wrote and I drew. This is a page from it. That then when the Unfortunates went to the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, we made this comic to go with that performance. And then also at that time I made this, this is a 15-page woodcut comic called The Traveler and the Housewife. So The Traveler and the Housewife, these are 20 by 30 inches, so they're about this big. And it tells the story. This is basically the Columbian Exchange, where it starts with the traveler is a conquistador who's based on Cabeza de Vaca. And I don't know if you know who Cabeza de Vaca was. He was a conquistador who crashed into Florida. They got shipwrecked, and then he traveled through what's now the Southwest. And he was enslaved, and then he also traveled all these different groups. And by the time he reached Mexico City, he was pretty fluent and also very, very sympathetic to the native people. And then The Housewife is based on a painting by Vermeer called The Milkmaid. It's one of my favorite paintings. And so in this story, the traveler goes off. He's got all these like little death heads floating off of him because he's about to go kind of infect this other place, but he's also going to become changed. And she goes into the depths of her own kind of native mythology. And then this is the last page where they are reunited. He has his head cut off, and out of there is coming these seeds. And so I produced this as a newsprint, like a big broadsheet newsprint comic. And I never did an edition of these, but last year the gallery that has just picked me up had asked me to edition them, so that now there's an edition of these. So as I'm kind of winding up the North American Codex, this was a series of plates and vessels. This is actually a big ceramic platter that has really big, chunky feet on it, so it can either sit on the table or it can sit on the wall. And I want to say one thing as I go through this. So I do work in all these different media. I work in pots and sculpture. I make comics and paint. And so when I'm working on these things, I'm doing a couple things at the same time. One is, when I'm making something that's a vessel, I'm both thinking of it as a piece that could, in this case, like literally could sit on the wall, like an art piece, but also it could be used. And I came up in ceramics anyway, where there was this hard line. You're either a functional potter or you're an artist. And it never made sense to me. So when I'm working in one of these mediums, if I'm painting, I'm bringing all I know from ceramics into painting and vice versa. So again, there's also, I had this weird, whenever things start to come together for me, it always collides with world events. So this show was up in late October and early November 2016. So I gave my talk right after the election of 2016. So this is Jaguar Man and Border Patrol with a flood coming. And then this is part of a series that I was commissioned to do in Portland in Southeast Portland. There's the Revolution Hall, which was an old Washington high school. And I was asked to do something that had to do with the idea of revolution, because this was a high school and they taught history there. And again, it's not unlike thinking about how history was taught when I did The Naked Boy. My take on that was what's revolutionary, what passes these radical ideas, what passes ideas that sustain people are stories. And stories are intergenerational. And in a story, it's not linear. It starts with something in the past could be as present and alive as something that's happening right now. So there's 5 panels on one side of the wall. This one, in each one, there's this huge she-wolf who's coming through as a witness to all that's happening. So this one's all about folk music. So you have Maybelle Carter, who's the grand dame of all this, passing all these ideas to Johnny Cash is up there, and then Buffy St. Marie, Odetta, and then Woody Guthrie. And then actually the person playing the letterpress is actually my wife. But I wanted that sense of this transmission of ideas through things like recorded music. And then on the other side, as you go down the other part of the hall, it follows this Columbia River from about Celilo Falls to the ocean. So this is Celilo Falls. So also right around this time, I had started when I was at Pacific Northwest College of Art, I had started a pilot program that I wanted to. I felt like what was happening with education, it was becoming too, at least in art education, I can't speak to anything else. I felt like it was becoming too professionalized in the sense that students were being treated like clients or customers. Faculty were being treated like Uber drivers. And there was this way that the administration was not, they were sort of forgetting, I think, what you should be doing, like what we should be doing as educators. So I started this thing called The Ground Beneath Us. The idea being, instead of having a menu of classes, you have a small cohort, like 15 students. We all work together. Your faculty are also working close by. And so there's this sense of you see what it means to be an artist, right? Because I remember when I went to art school, no one told me how to do this. I just remember I thought, well, I guess I'm supposed to now move to New York City. A gallery will pick me up, and then I'll be like fabulous and rich, have a house in, on Long Island. I mean, I'm fabulous and rich. I just, have a house in Long Island. But no, it was like I just wanted something that was really this kind of connection. And it was a successful pilot, but the problem was that the administration wasn't that interested. So I had a friend who had some land in Waterford, Virginia, which I'd never really been to, that part of the world. And he wanted to start an artist residency. So we took this Ground Beneath Us idea and we went there. So I went to go scope it out. And right near where his place was, this is near close to Washington, D.C., is Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is where the abolitionist John Brown had a group of men. They were going to raid the federal armory. They were going to take all the arms out of there. They were going to go around and surround the countryside. They were going to arm enslaved people, and they were going to escape into the hills, and they were going to stop slavery. He was famously, he almost did it, but he was also like kind of very bullheaded. He got caught. In fact, he was friends with Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass said he wanted Frederick Douglass with him because he saw what a kind of leader he was. And Frederick Douglass said, "Don't do it. It's a trap. You're going to get trapped in there." That's exactly what happened. So I went to Harper's Ferry to visit it, and I knew a little bit about the story. And here's the other thing I'll say about the way I work. I feel like my process as an artist is like a wayfinder. I don't have like a map where I'm going from one to the other. I kind of move through, and I have guide points that I stumble my way into. And this was one of those cases where I was in Harper's Ferry. I felt like John Brown reached out and said, "We have business together. We have work to do." So this is 2017, summer of 2017, and I start to research this a lot. And one thing I realized I don't want to be, I thought I'm an artist. I'm not a historian, but I'm going to do a lot of I'm going to do a lot of research, but I'm not actually trying to make something that's about the linear history, because these are also images that live in our culture. They're images that live in the world that actually have that means certain things to different people. So I started with this idea of this. This is Osborne Anderson, who was a freedman who had joined John Brown on his raid. And I wanted to do a series of portraits with these people from the past as if they were my sitters. I wanted that as if I were sitting with them, and then you as the viewer, they're looking at you. And so there's always something in the background in the window. So in the background you can see a little hint of the Washington Cross in Delaware. And then those two pistols were the pistols that Lafayette gave to Washington. You know Lafayette? Everyone? Anyway. He was a really good singer, apparently, Lafayette, as was Hamilton. I think I've read that in the history books. So anyway, he got this in this raid, he took this from Washington's great, nephew, whoever was in there. And there was symbolic because it was as a black man taking these pistols. So this is Osborne Anderson as if he were my sitter. So then that became this series called John Brown's Vision on the Scaffold. I went to MacDowell, which is an artist residency, and I had time to really think about this. And this was one of the first images that came up. This is watercolor on paper. It's about 45 inches by 36 inches. John Brown was a huge admirer of people like Nat Brown, who led a slave revolt in 1815. And he really felt like the abolitionist movement was the pacifism of the abolitionist movement was no longer working, particularly the way the slave powers of the South were kind of twisting the laws of the country. So this is him on the scaffold looking at this vision of the future. There's Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was the one who arrested John Brown, and that's when he was still in the United States Army. So here's where that title comes from. So John Brown leads these men. A bunch of them get killed. The South now is convinced that the abolitionists are going to take over. John Brown needs to be shown what a danger he is, so they're going to hang him. But it took about a month and a half before he was hung. And in that time, he wrote all these convincing letters to people like Henry David Thoreau, who was a avowed pacifist, who realized something has to give in this slave system. So he really changed the mood of Northern abolitionists, so much to the point where the song John Brown's Body was the marching song for the Union Army. But what happened was they wanted to humiliate him, so they drove him on his own coffin to the scaffold, and then there was a big show thing where all these soldiers were lining up, one of whom was John Wilkes Booth, who shot Lincoln, who was an actor, and he convinced a soldier to give him his clothes so he could watch John Brown be hung. And so but John Brown, because they were all getting into formation so they could watch him be hung, he stood there for 10 minutes with the hood over his head and a noose around his neck. And according to the hangman, he just stood there really stock still because John Brown was convinced that he was doing it right. So this whole body of work is imagining what was the visions that John Brown had in that 10 minutes. So it goes back and forth in time. So he was friends with Harriet Tubman. He was actually hoping Harriet Tubman would come and join him, but she didn't. So this is John Brown and Harriet Tubman getting someone out of a supermax prison. So there's a contemporary figure. And this is called Abolitionists in the Flood. So again, treating these figures as if they were my sitters, but here they are sitting on the couch as if posing, and there's a flood coming around them. You'll see also my work, there's a lot of other things like tarot imagery. So you have the Harriet Tubman's holding the lantern, which is like the pentacles. That pike that John Brown has is like the wands. And in the background, you'll see the Fisher King from Arthurian legend. That's the wounded king from that legend. If the king is wounded, the land is wounded. So they're sitting there. You have all these people who are at different points in their life. They never would have been able to do this because some of them would have been dead at this time, but it's this kind of spirit of that. So I did so I continued this series with people that were around him. This is John Brown's, these are the people that were with him, of his family members, they had a farmhouse in Maryland as they scoped out the space in Harper's Ferry. And so the two sons that are nearest him with the yellow jacket and the green vest were killed, but the other one who's old, who's holding that slain, the slaughtered lamb, was his son Owen, who was kind of his right-hand man, and he was able to escape and then escape to California. And then again, in the window, you'll always see outside the window, there's some other kind of mythic event happening that's affecting what's in the events of the portraiture. This is co-conspirators. These are all the black men who came with John Brown. They all had different reasons. Some of them were freed, some of them had escaped. That's the Amistad in the background, which was famous for the Amistad Revolt, for being a space where a black man was able to articulate through the law why they need to be freed, and those are soldiers guarding the beach. Another thing was happening, when I start doing the research, I do a lot of research for this kind of thing, I was thinking, well, I should really research the cloth and the colors and be as true as possible. But I was looking at this, one painter particularly really changed my mind on that. His name was T.C. Cannon. He died about 1979. He's a native painter, really amazing painter who worked with these flat colors. So I wanted, so you can see those are obviously not, those colors are really keyed up. But as a painter, I wanted these to be about the painting as well. So that then I really just pushed that chroma. This is the triptych of the women who were the wives of these famous abolitionists. So Mary, and each one of them, behind them, there's a folk tale being told that it's about women who find their own power in the woods. So you have Mary Brown on the far left, that was John Brown's wife, Ann Douglas, and I just did this yesterday. The name of that person is someone I really know because I've done all the research. I'm forgetting it. Can you all send me your text numbers, and I'll text you at 3 in the morning when I remember this thing I know. And then also any kind of banking information you have. So along with this, he wrote. Okay, I'm gonna pause because I can't believe I can't remember her name, which I know really well. I also did these still lifes. So one of the things that happened with John Brown, he was injured, and as the soldiers came in to get him, he was almost killed, but he wasn't, and so he stood trial on a pallet with his head bandaged. So these still lifes kind of have all this drama playing in the background. And then this is a landscape called Gallows Word, the Empire Makes Its Way. There's a famous painting by Emmanuel Lutz, which is in the Capitol, called Westward, the Empire Makes Its Way. And it's an image of like the Eliza Garrison, thank you. Yeah, William Wood, thank you for doing that. I hate to ask Google, but you know. Okay. Oh, thank you. William Wood Garrison's wife, yeah. He was the publisher of The Liberator. So this is based on a painting by Thomas Cole, who was a famous 19th century painter. So all these artists in the early 19th century, they're trying to define what America is. And so they were defining America by land and by this kind of sublime landscape, while erasing the actual history of the peoples who were there. And in this Westward, the Course of Empire Makes Its Way, it shows all these, like, it shows like trappers, and then there's mountain men, and then it's like the line of, again, it's like that history lesson we all get, like the triumphant, you know, movement of people until you get to the townspeople. So this is John Brown on his horse, with way in the background, being led to the scaffold, which hangs the sword, and the song John Brown's body. It mentions his terrible swift sword. This is an amazing time. I got a Guggenheim Fellowship. I had a show in the Orange County Museum of Art. This show was going to be at the Jordan Schitzer Museum of Art in PSU, one of the first shows there, and it was all set to open March 5th, 2020. So like 10 people saw it, and it was kind of trapped there. But I also had another show. I was supposed to actually travel, but I was going to add some pieces to the Schneider Museum of Art in Ashland later that year. So I had to make a whole bunch of new work that summer. And also, if you remember what happened that summer, living in Portland, I live in close to downtown in Portland. So this park next to us was a gathering space for a lot of the rallies that would peacefully walk downtown. But there were also police helicopters circling overhead. And I would, look at these really amazing murals that were happening, this artwork that was being produced in that moment, thinking, and actually that work I just showed you was 2 blocks away from where everything was happening downtown. This stuff that's about abolitionists. I felt like at that point, there's certain imagery it's not mine. There's certain I can't use. It's not for me to use. And I also thought about, when I looked at a lot of the images that were on these wonderful street murals and everything, I think of it as like, that it was really hot, meaning it was really fresh, and it was for that moment. Where I work, when I talk about all this mythological work and thinking about these large spans of time, I'm working with fermented images. So images that have been fermented and have gone through that process. So I had actually planned, before I knew there was going to be a pandemic, that I was going to try to do portraits of contemporary abolitionists. Because everything was remote, and I started to feel like if I do, I'll feel like I am exploiting a moment, and I don't want to do that. So I start to think about who are the artists, who are the thinkers, who have influenced me, who are influenced by John Brown. So this is W.E.B. Du Bois. It's called 5 Cups over Harper's Ferry. That's Harper's Ferry in the background. W.E.B. Du Bois, you probably know, wrote wonderful writer, really influential writer who was also part of Storer College, which was in Harper's Ferry as a black college. When he was asked to write a biography of a great American, he chose John Brown, which was really interesting. And so that 5 Cups, again, is another little tarot reference. So right before the show opened, I don't know if you remember all this, but everything was on fire because of we had the forest fires, especially in Portland, were coming really close. It just felt like a really chaotic time. So this is a 8 foot by 6 foot painting, and it's called Migrations. The grieving woman knows your real name. And so this is contemporary, but it comes from a moment in the story of Parsifal, who is the Arthurian knight who finds the Grail, and he's the one who finds and is able to change that story with the Grail. In the story, Parsifal starts out as like a lunk-headed young man who just like goes like a lot of young people, but young men like kind of like bumbling through the world. They just like with no all impulse. And early in his journey, he meets a woman who's in the woods holding her dead lover, who's a knight. And she says, "You don't know," because his mom had kept him away from the court, so he didn't know really who he was. And she said, "You don't know who you are. You're Parsifal. You're my cousin, and my lover is dead because of your kingdom's war. And he died for you." And so, Parsifal is like, "I don't know how to process this," and he goes on, and he has all these other adventures. He comes to the Grail Castle, and that's where he encounters the Fisher King, who's out in this pond, in the middle of it, fishing serenely. And he finds this castle, and he is invited in, and he's shown this host of these incredible things, like this, these, as if the heavens became embodied and were marching through him, and there's this wounded king looking at him. But he was at this moment in his life, and a lot of you are younger, so you might be in this, well, actually we all have this moment, where he's got his mom's advice, which is like, listen to what old people say, he has all his mom's advice, then he had his mentor's advice, don't ask too many questions, otherwise you're going to be annoying, all this other, so he just sits there, and he doesn't know how to make his own decision. Everyone's waiting for him to say something. He's supposed to ask a question, which is the empathetic question. What ails you? And that's what will heal the king and heal the land. He doesn't do it. He gets kicked out of the castle the next morning. He has no idea what he's really just seen. He runs into his cousin again. Her lover is like, more skeletal than anything. She's carrying him around. And she says, "You've been in the Grail Castle, so you did it. You asked the question, right?" And he just said, "No, I didn't know I was supposed to." She just says, "You fool, because you didn't do that. Now things are gonna be worse," and so the land is suffering. So I took that, and I think that's a really beautiful moment in that story. So in this, there's some of that story where the Parsifal becomes not a knight, but this riot top. And there's John Brown in the background crossing the river, kind of like the river Styx. And so that's where this came out of that hot, smoky, desperate moment of late 2020. In 2019, this is where this work downstairs picks up. I had also had another body of work that I started to do. This is at the Orange County Museum of Art. This is another 6 by 8 foot painting. Again, like you can see the hangman, and you'll see there's a hanging coyote downstairs as well. This is called For Those Who Are Hanged. That show is called Tree Time Stories Told, Underland Stories Told in Tree Time. And there's another one of those root stories. The other thing that happened after 3 years of working with John Brown in American history and abolitionism and going through 2020 and then January 6th, I was exhausted. Actually, even for this show, I had an idea that we had talked about that was going to be in a response to that painting of the Capitol, and I couldn't do it anymore. I just needed something that was like here, that was like really rooted in something much deeper and much more that's always in this work, which is this kind of sense of the animism of the world. So I started to do this series called the Still Life of the Wild Man. So in the background you see this wild man. So the wild man is this figure you see in European stories where he lives in the woods. He's kind of a hairy man. And so these are all still lifes that reflect that. And then this is called the Poet's Communion. So that's Walt Whitman, again, he shows up a lot. Pablo Neruda, Denise Levertov, and that white snake that he's holding is from a Grimm's story called The White Snake, in which this king has some sort of secret knowledge. He's very secretive when he eats this particular dish. And so his servant, who's this young man, one day sneaks in. It's this white snake, and he takes a bite of it. And suddenly, when he has the snake, he can hear all the voices and then there's a whole other story. I'm not going to tell you that where it goes, but it goes on all these adventures. But it's the snake becomes the thing that allows him to hear the living world. This is after the painter Velázquez. Which is his painting is called Two-Minute Table. So this is a Two-Minute Table after Velázquez. It's kind of shamanic figures. This is Incident in a Dry Riverbed. So this is where I was working a couple of years ago. This is a portrait of a friend of mine, Hank Pander, who died last year. He was a really great painter. Some of you may have seen his work. Super prolific. He came from Dutch, or was Dutch. Makes really big history paintings. He did all these beautiful paintings that were witnessing all the protests in 2020. He did, throughout his life, he was this kind of witness of history, but he also is an amazing portraitist. So as he was dying, I did this portrait. I sat and drew him, took some pictures, and did this. So this is probably going back to the portraiture, but I think the next step for me is going to start to find other artists to do portraits of, not like John Brown, who I'm extrapolating from like old little black and white photographs, but people who are still with us. So this is a series of large tree watercolors. These are 36 inches by 45 inches, so about 3 by 4. And this is Kelly Point Park. This is in Dufur. My friend has a ranch out there where he has this whole protected white oak. So in this case, part of, for me, after all that working in that American history, is to actually be present in the land itself, and to see what the land has to say to me. So that leads us to this. I'm going to go through these really quickly because you can see them downstairs in better versions. But these are I did these this year at Playa. So these are all based on tarot cards. So there's Coyote's Travels. This is Strength, the Hanging Man. A lot of this imagery comes from dreams that I had. This is the Fool and Death. And you'll notice in a lot of these there's a framing device where you are inside. So if in the portraits we're inside and there's a frame of looking outside that's happening. In this case, now we're in some sort of space looking out to the landscape. In this case, a cave. And that plays out a little bit. And this is the title page called American Underland. And what's interesting about the show downstairs is that, unlike when I worked on John Brown, where I could really articulate what that thing was about, I could say enough so I can get some grants. This is like wayfinding. I had images that I wanted to use. A lot of these would come through the process. This one in particular was supposed to be a series of processions of all these marchers and people. I couldn't get the composition right, so I kept erasing the people until it ended up just being this, and that monk showed up by accident. And when I was doing the underpainting, I had a quick drawing of a figure to give me scale, and then I was like, oh, that's a monk. I guess he needs to be there. And then that figure underground was always going to be there. And this is an image that comes from a site that was in downtown Portland where it was torn down. But I'm excited about what's happening with that chain link fence. That was sort of the last addition. And now what I'm excited about the work downstairs is that it's juicy to me because I don't know the answers to that. I know that there's more for me to explore there. This is Paisley Caves, which is down in southeast Oregon. This is where human remains that are 15,000 years old have been found, which really pushes back what used to be the dominant narrative of occupation in America. So this show is really about time, I realized. So Janus has it, you'll see down there with the Janus was the Roman god of doorways where he looks forward and back. Actually, they look forward and back because sometimes it's male, female, old, young. This is a fire-fallen tree near Summer Lake. And then here are some of these figures. And a lot of these came about, if you were to look at my sketchbook, you would recognize some of this, but it was in the building that these things came together. And so these Janus heads, and this is also going to be returned to ceramics as well. Like for instance, this figure I was working on was going to be 3 different pieces. And then I just thought, oh wait, this actually, this works together. And then there was going to be something else happening coming out of that kind of amphora form. And I had this branch of that old Oregon oak, and it was like a lightning strike to me. So there's a way that these Janus heads, they have, for me, they have a kind of power that I know the source of a lot of it, but I don't know, they're strangers to me, so I can actually, there's space for me to think about them. And this is the Janus of the Crossroads. And then this is alchemical chamber for lost land. And I'm just going to very quickly, I know this is going to go kind of long, but this is another project I've been working on, which is a shadow puppet performance. This is Building 5, which is in Northwest Portland, where I'm the creative director. This is based on Gawain and the Green Knight. And so my friend Mark Orton, who's a composer, does the music, and Ramiz, who I mentioned earlier, is the narrator. I wrote it and directed it. And then their images are from some friends from the UK who have a thing called the Golden Thread Project. And so I think we're gonna do this again. This is in 2022. The original version was canceled because of COVID. But I just want to see if I can, we'll just watch a little bit of it.
Act 3. Autumn sends a save the date card. The first dry leaves blow into the vestibule. The heat has worn us all out, as much as we will have warm skin. The forest fires are everywhere when it comes sooner time. Gawain can no longer forget what has been promised. The bill is going due. He has to keep things in right relationship. Summer's sweetness begins to ferment. It is time for Gawain
Those
to
images, so these are images by this amazing illustrator. I mean, I did some of the
longing
images.
fills the
This
young
is
man's
done by
sad.
this great Welsh illustrator
What more
named
hard
Ian
is to
Saucer, who
enjoy
does.
before he sets out?
When he sent me
The
these
rains
images,
come and the deciduous forest
excited about
sheds its leaves. Gawain says goodbye for the last time to the comforts of home.
I was hoping I could fast
He
forward.
sets off
That's
north
right, we
with his
can
own
stop
soul
here.
as his lodestar to the Green Chapel.
Anyway, so yeah, just like really to just wrap up. Thank you all for listening, and hopefully this gives you some insight to what goes into the show downstairs. Yeah, and I'll take any questions.
Yeah, do you want to do questions?
Yeah.
I'll get that.
Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yeah.
Can you incorporate the tarot in there? The carding is what you're going into, that feel for what the card portrays on the deck?
Yeah, for sure. And then also, like if you really are reading the tarot, there's 2 ways to read, and there's more than 2 ways to read it, but one way of reading the tarot is to like go to the meanings and like be really, specific. But the other way is that you have a sense of what those things mean, but you let the image kind of speak to you, and that's more of the approach I use. So like the 5 cups that are spilt with W.E.B. Du Bois, that's I've thought about that idea of there's some cups left that still have something in it, but something's been lost. And I think of his writing and the way he thinks about that history, that's why I would use that.
I had a question about a specific piece. I think it was the woodcut with the lion and the honeybees.
Oh, yeah.
That actually reminded me less of American folklore and more of straight up the Bible, like with Samson. Is
Oh,
that
yeah.
intentional?
Well, it is actually, this song is called Samson and Delilah.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
I was wondering if
So
that
it is
was-
directly from that. And it's a blues song, most famously done, I'm trying to think. Yeah, so that's where it is. So totally Samson. Yeah. And actually, we were just talking about bees at the beginning of this. So I have one thing that happened this summer, I have a beehive. I'm not a very good beekeeper. I'm more of a bee watcher. Like I get bees and I like to watch them. I don't like to mess with them too much. I don't like dig in there to get honey. Sometimes I do. But they always die, and then I don't know how to keep them alive. And I think it's a problem in the Pacific Northwest. So this year I didn't get any. I just decided not to. And a hive moved into the box, and I felt like that was like a really auspicious thing. So the honeycomb that you see in the piece, the alchemical vessel piece downstairs, is from not this hive, but the earlier hive that I used to clean out. But this one I didn't clean out, so anyway, there's bees there. But bees are the things that keep coming up in my the imagery for me. Like when I talk about wayfinding as an artist, their images follow. You probably noticed they follow me through all these things, even when I think I'm doing something totally different. Any other questions?